5 men sat in a room that did not exist, in a building that had no address, in a year that would later be quietly removed from the official record. The vote took 11 minutes. There were no abstentions. One man who might have complicated the vote had been told there was something he needed to see in another room, a small courtesy, a manufactured errand, and he sat there now, rearranging his thoughts, believing himself among friends. The man's name was Bruce Banner. The vote was about him. The 5 men sitting at the long table, Tony Stark, Reed Richards, Stephen Strange, Namor of Atlantis, and Blackagar Boltagon of the Inhumans, had determined, in his absence, that Bruce Banner represented a threat the world could no longer absorb, that the margin between tolerable risk and catastrophe had narrowed beyond what any calculation could justify, and because they believed themselves to be the kind of men who solved what other men only suffered, they had found a solution. They called themselves the Illuminati. The name had not been chosen with irony, though it would come to deserve it in ways none of them could have predicted. They were the finest scientific minds of their generation, the most gifted practitioners of the mystic arts, the rulers of hidden kingdoms and stewards of power, accumulated over decades of impossible survival. They were not governments. They were not elected. They had not been authorized by any body that could be audited, challenged, or recalled. They had gathered because Tony Stark had looked at the wreckage of the Kree-Skrull War, at the scorched sky and the narrow margin by which the Earth had endured, and arrived at a thought that seemed obvious to him, and that had not occurred to anyone else. If the greatest minds on Earth had simply spoken to each other, the war might never have reached them at all. So he brought them together. And the first thing they did once they had assembled the council that would protect the world was exile one of its greatest defenders, without his knowledge, without his consent, and with every intention of telling themselves it was for the best. That is the central irony of the Illuminati. Not that they were villains. They were not villains. Not that they were incompetent. They were individually among the most capable beings in recorded human history. The irony was simpler than villainy, and more devastating than incompetence. They believed that the quality which made each of them exceptional, the certainty, the precision, the willingness to act where others only debated, was also what made them qualified to act in secret, without oversight, on behalf of a world that had never asked them to. How 5 brilliant men built the most powerful hidden council in history, and how that council became the origin of nearly every catastrophe it had formed to prevent, begins not with the vote to exile Bruce Banner, but with the silence that came before it. The vast, terrifying silence of a war that had ended and left no one in charge of making sure it never began again. The world they were protecting did not know it needed protection in this particular form. The Avengers were public. The Fantastic Four were public. The X-Men, despite their complications, were known. But the Illuminati had been designed to be something different from those things. Not a team with a membership roster and a headquarters address and a press liaison, but an absence. A silence at the center of the world's greatest threats. A room where the decisions were made that other rooms never heard about. The theory was sound in the way that theories are sound before they are tested. The theory was that 5 extraordinary minds meeting in secret could identify and manage threats before those threats became visible to anyone else. What the theory did not account for was what happens when the threat is the room itself. If you would rather close your eyes and simply listen, find us on Spotify. The link is in the description. Take a slow breath. Let the air settle. You're not in a hurry, and neither is this story. It moves the way all important things move, not in a rush, but in the long, patient accumulation of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The Kree-Skrull War of what the records would later call the early modern era of superhuman conflict was not, from the perspective of the universe, a large war. Measured against the scale of galaxies, it was a skirmish, a border dispute between two empires that had been fighting in one form or another for millions of years. Measured against the scale of a single planet named Earth, it was the closest the species had ever come to ceasing to exist without knowing it. The Kree arrived first, the Skrulls followed. The Avengers, Earth's assembled champions, found themselves caught between two civilizations, each of which regarded the planet as either a strategic prize or a convenient battlefield, and neither of which had been asked permission before beginning to use it. The sky above New York filled with shapes that had no terrestrial names. The mathematics of the conflict, had anyone run them clearly, suggested that Earth's survival probability hovered somewhere below 40%. It did not end cleanly. Wars between empires rarely do. What it ended with was a narrow margin and a great silence. The particular silence that descends on a battlefield when the noise stops before anyone has fully processed what just happened. The Avengers stood in that silence and looked at each other across it, and what they felt, if they were honest with themselves, was not triumph. It was something closer to vertigo. They had fought as hard as they could, and it had nearly not been enough, and the reason it had nearly not been enough had almost nothing to do with power levels or tactical skill. It had to do with information, with coordination, with the simple, devastating fact that the most powerful beings on Earth had spent the entire crisis not knowing what the other most powerful beings on Earth were doing. Tony Stark understood this before the last ship had cleared the atmosphere. He had that particular gift, not just intelligence, but the ability to identify the shape of a failure and trace it to its root. Standing in the wreckage of what the war had made of Midtown Manhattan, watching Reed Richards and Doctor Strange and the others recede into their separate vehicles and their separate headquarters and their separate sovereign lives, Tony understood with the clarity that only near death produces what the problem actually was. It was not that they lacked power, it was that they lacked a table, a room, a reason to sit together before the crisis arrived, rather than scrambling toward each other as it unfolded. He drafted the invitations himself. He addressed them to 6 people, 6 specific people, out of all the extraordinary beings who inhabited or orbited the Earth, and his criteria for selection were precise. He wanted intellect, but not merely intelligence. He wanted power, but not merely strength. He wanted individuals who had demonstrated across years of crisis management something rarer than either of those things, the capacity to see a problem in its entirety rather than only the piece of it that concerned them most. The list he arrived at was Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, whose mind operated at scales of complexity that no instrument had ever fully mapped. Stephen Strange, the Sorcerer Supreme, whose access to information from beyond the physical universe represented a dimension of knowledge that no laboratory could replicate. Blackagar Boltagun, the Black Bolt, whose silence concealed a civilization older than most nations, and a perspective the surface world could not afford to ignore. Namor, the Submariner, who ruled 2/3 of the planet's surface and had lived long enough to have watched 3 civilizations rise and fall. Charles Xavier, whose network of telepathic contacts constituted the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation in the Northern Hemisphere. And T'Challa, the Black Panther, King of Wakanda, whose nation had maintained technological and philosophical independence for 4,000 years, and understood something about long-term thinking that the rest of them were only beginning to grasp. They all came. T'Challa arrived last, and he arrived with the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he is going to say. He listened to Tony's presentation, the near miss of the Kree-Skrull War, the coordination failure, the proposal for a standing council of consultation, the secrecy that would be required to make it work, and he did not interrupt, and when Tony finished, T'Challa was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to confirm he had heard everything before speaking. He said that he understood the problem Tony was describing. He said that he agreed the coordination failure had been real and costly. He said that he would not be joining the council. His reasoning was not simple, and it deserves more than a summary. T'Challa told them that what Tony was proposing was not a solution to the problem of uncoordinated power. It was a concentration of that power into a smaller, less visible, and therefore less accountable form. He told them that a secret council of the most powerful beings on Earth, operating without oversight, without mandate, and without the knowledge of the people whose lives it would affect, was not a safeguard against the misuse of power. It was the definition of it. He told them that Wakanda had spent 4,000 years refusing exactly this kind of arrangement, the invitation to sit at a table where decisions were made for others, and that he did not intend to begin now. Then he stood up. He thanked Tony for the invitation, and he left. The 5 men who remained sat with T'Challa's words for a moment that, by mutual unspoken agreement, none of them would later acknowledge having felt the weight of. Tony moved the conversation forward. There was work to be done, and the fact that a man with the clearest view of the room had chosen not to stay in it was not, in Tony's estimation, a veto. It was a disagreement. The Illuminati had differences of opinion all the time. That was, he told himself, the whole point of having the table. Sit with that for a moment, if you are still awake enough to sit with anything. The man who saw most clearly what the council was chose not to join it, and the 5 men who stayed, who were not by any measure less intelligent or less principled than T'Challa, told themselves his reasoning was worth considering, filed it away as noted, and proceeded anyway. This is not a story about evil. It is a story about how the architecture of good intentions produces rooms where certain questions never get asked twice. What the 5 remaining members discovered in their first formal information sharing session was staggering in a quiet way. The way discoveries are staggering when they arrive not as revelations, but as confirmations of a fear you'd been carrying without naming. Each of them knew things the others did not. Strange had mapped interdimensional incursion routes that Tony's satellites had never detected. Tony had corporate intelligence on weapons program proliferation that none of the others had access to. Reed had been tracking an anomaly in the fabric of space-time that Xavier's network had picked up as a psychic disturbance, but could not locate. Black Bolt knew of 3 civilizations in neighbouring star systems that had been watching Earth since the Kree-Skrull War, and had not yet announced themselves. Namor had diplomatic contact with Atlantean outposts that tracked movement in deep ocean, that corresponded, he now realized, with patterns Tony recognized from Hydra's underwater operations. The map they assembled together in that first session was not just larger than any individual map they had been carrying. It was a different kind of map, one that revealed, by its very coherence, how many crucial connections had been invisible, while the knowledge that would have revealed them was fragmented across separate vaults. They did not celebrate this, they sat with it. The room was climate-controlled and quiet, and the silence had the particular quality of silence in a space where extraordinary things have just been understood. They established 3 founding principles. The first was absolute secrecy. Nothing decided in this room would be disclosed to governments, to other heroes, to allies, or to anyone outside the Council without unanimous vote. The second was consultation before action. No member would take unilateral action on any matter the Council had discussed without first bringing it to a vote. The third was the hardest and the one they would break first. No member would make a decision that affected the life of any individual, hero, civilian, villain, or anyone else, on the Council's behalf without that individual's knowledge and consent. They all agreed to these principles. They shook hands across the table. The room was warm, and outside the city made the sounds a city makes when it has survived something and not yet stopped to think about it. They would meet quarterly in locations that rotated. They would keep no written records. They would vote by direct declaration, with a simple majority required for most matters and unanimity for the most significant ones. They would pool intelligence on threats that exceeded the scale of any individual team's mandate. They would, Tony believed, prevent the next Kree-Skrull War before it arrived at their atmosphere. He said as much in the closing minutes of the first meeting, and none of the others contradicted him. because they believed it too. Not one of them, in that room, on that day, thought to ask what would happen when the council's judgment was wrong. When the vote was unanimous, and the decision was made, and the person it affected was sitting in the next room believing himself among friends. The principles were in place, the table was assembled, the Illuminati existed in the quiet way that things exist when they have no formal name, no charter, no building, and no accountability to anyone outside themselves. The world outside continued its business without knowing that 5 of the most powerful beings in it had just decided to watch over it. This is what protection sometimes looks like from the inside of it. A room, a table, a handshake, and the absolute certainty that the people in the room are the right people, that the people outside the room need not be consulted, that the decision being made is the correct one, because the people making it are brilliant, and because they mean well, and because the alternative, not deciding, not acting, leaving the coordination failure in place, is so much worse that the flaws in the solution feel negligible by comparison. The architecture of the space they chose for their first meeting was deliberate, not elegant, functional. A room that could be reached by multiple routes, that offered multiple exits, that was monitored externally by systems Tony had integrated into existing surveillance infrastructure, without leaving traces that the existing infrastructure would recognize as foreign. The room had a table. The table had 6 chairs. The 6th chair was T'Challa's, and after he left it, it remained where it was. No one moved it. No one suggested moving it. It remained in the configuration of a table at which the right answer had been present, had declined to stay, and had left a space that none of the remaining members filled. This is a small detail. It is the kind of small detail that reveals in retrospect more than the large decisions do. What is worth understanding about the founding members, about Tony and Reed and Strange and Namor and Xavier and Black Bolt, considered together as a unit, is that they were not, in the ordinary sense, friends. They were not people who had grown close across years of shared experience and mutual understanding and the slow accumulation of trust that friendship requires. They were colleagues. They were peers. They had worked alongside each other in crisis after crisis and had each developed a specific assessment of what the others were capable of, and those assessments were accurate and grounded and genuinely respectful. But respect between extraordinarily capable people is not the same as the kind of relationship that produces honest disagreement. Honest disagreement requires a willingness to be wrong in front of someone else, and the members of the Illuminati were people for whom that willingness was the hardest thing the world had ever asked of them. They had each spent their entire lives being right, or being made to feel that being right was the only adequate response to what they were capable of. This is not a character flaw. It is a structural feature of the kind of person the world produces when it combines extraordinary capability with extraordinary stakes. It was also, quietly, the most important vulnerability the Council had. The flaws were not negligible, but no one in the room knew that yet. What they knew, as the first meeting adjourned and the lights dimmed and the building that had no address returned to its ordinary appearance, was that they had something they had not had before the Kree-Skrull War. A room where they could talk. The next thing they needed to figure out was who to talk to. The answer, which they would arrive at within the year, was the Skrulls. They would go directly to the Skrull throne world, deliver a message in person, and make absolutely clear that Earth was defended. It seemed, in the way that things seem when you are very intelligent and very certain and very wrong, like a perfect plan. Breathe slowly. The story moves forward now, into the first of the Council's decisions, and it is important to understand that nothing in what follows was done with malice. The Illuminati genuinely believed they were preventing a war. The distance between that belief and what they actually accomplished is the distance the story travels. The Skrull Empire had not retreated after the Kree-Skrull War. Retreat was not a concept the Skrulls entertained with any seriousness. They were an ancient civilization built on the premise that any territory they had ever held was territory they were entitled to reclaim, and they had held Earth in some form or another in their strategic calculations for a very long time. The intelligence Tony had gathered in the months following the war's end made this clear. Skrull reconstruction was underway. The Empire was rebuilding its fleet, reconsolidating its command structure, and producing a generation of soldiers who had been raised on the failure of the previous incursion as a personal wound that required answering. This was not a hypothetical future threat. It was a scheduled one. The Illuminati's analysts, all 5 of them, working from their separate data sets and then pooling the results, placed the probability of a renewed Skrull attempt at Earth at above 70% within a generation. Tony Stark's proposed response had a particular flavour that would come to define the Council's early philosophy: preemptive, personal, and dramatic. Rather than building defences, rather than establishing protocols, rather than quietly constructing a deterrent that the Skrulls might eventually discover through intelligence of their own, Tony proposed going to the Skrull homeworld directly. Going in person. Walking into the throne room of the Skrull Empress and delivering a message that could not be misconstrued or filtered through layers of interstellar diplomacy, he proposed telling the Skrulls face to face that Earth was defended by the Illuminati, by these 5 specific individuals, and that any assault on the planet would constitute an act of war against every power they represented. The reasoning was not unsound. Name recognition in the circles of cosmic politics that governed the galaxy's older civilizations carried a weight that weapons could not replicate. The Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the Sorcerer Supreme, the Inhumans, and the King of Atlantis were not simply heroes. They were symbols of a planet that had survived impossible threats and continued to produce individuals of extraordinary capability. The Skrull Empire, like most empires, operated on a calculus that weighed potential gain against potential cost. Tony believed that putting a face, 5 faces, on the cost of attacking Earth would shift that calculus decisively. The journey to the Skrull throne world took several days by the standards of the technology available to them. Reed Richards handled the navigational calculations. The ship they used was small enough to avoid triggering automated border detection arrays and equipped with a cloaking system that Strange and Tony had developed together, one of the first genuine collaborative outputs of the Council, a piece of technology that wove mystic concealment into an electronic stealth matrix in a way that neither of them could have produced independently. The silence of deep space settled around them as they travelled. Through the viewports, stars that had no names in any Earth-derived catalogue moved slowly past. The distances involved, the sheer, patient emptiness of the space between things, had a quality that was, for all of them, a reminder of how small any single planet was in the arithmetic of the universe. The Skrull throne world was not what they expected, and it was exactly what they should have expected. Empires of a certain age develop a particular aesthetic, monumental, deliberate, arranged for the production of a specific psychological response in anyone who enters. The throne room was vast in the way that spaces are vast when they are designed to make visitors feel small. The Empress received them with the particular stillness of someone who had been expecting them and had used the advance notice to decide in precise detail how the conversation would proceed. They delivered the message. Tony spoke for the group, as he had planned to do, and he was direct in the manner he was always direct. Clear, specific, and carrying beneath the clarity a current of genuine authority that came not from performance, but from the actual fact of what he was. He told the Empress that Earth was under the protection of the Illuminati. He listed each member. He described, briefly and without melodrama, what each of them was capable of. He said that the Skrull Empire was free to make whatever calculations it wished about the wisdom of a renewed attempt, and that the Illuminati had come, as a courtesy, to ensure those calculations were complete. The Empress listened without interruption. She was very still. When Tony finished, she was quiet for a moment, and in the years that followed, each member of the Illuminati would return to that moment of stillness and understand it differently. At the time, they read it as consideration. They read it as the pause of a ruler weighing a genuine warning. What it actually was, what they would not understand until much later, was a decision. The Empress had decided something in that pause, and then she moved her hand slightly, and the room changed. They were taken, quickly, efficiently, and without the kind of violence that would have allowed them to resist with any dignity. The Skrull technology that achieved this was of a class none of them had encountered before. It operated on principles that Reed could not immediately analyze and that Strange's mystic defenses could not immediately counter. They were separated. They were studied. For a period of time that would later be impossible to calculate precisely because none of them had access to any reliable timekeeping, they were subjected to a process that the Skrull scientists would later describe, in the internal documents recovered during the events that followed, as deep biological and behavioral mapping. They were not harmed in ways that were obvious. They were observed in ways that were thorough. What the Skrulls extracted from them was not information, in the conventional sense. The Skrulls did not ask them questions and record their answers. What the Skrulls extracted was biological, genetic, behavioral. The kind of data that would allow a sufficiently advanced civilization to construct a perfect replica of a person, not just a physical copy, but a functional one. A copy that could replicate not just appearance, but power. A copy that could pass as Tony Stark in a room full of people who knew Tony Stark, or as Reed Richards in a room full of instruments calibrated to detect Reed Richards. The Skrull scientists had been working toward this capability for decades, in theoretical form, and what the Illuminati's visit provided was not a breakthrough exactly, but an acceleration. The specific data from 5 individuals of extraordinary ability compressed what would have been another generation of research into something they could implement within years. They escaped. The details of the escape were, in later retellings by each of the 5 members, notably inconsistent, as if the memory of the experience had been processed differently by each mind, and the process of processing had altered the version each person retained. What is consistent across all 5 accounts is that they left, that they made it back to Earth, that no one was killed, though the definitions of harm they were working with at the time of that assessment would later seem inadequate. The question they faced, returning home, was what to do with the knowledge of what had happened. They had gone to warn the Skrulls. The Skrulls had captured them and used the visit to build something the Illuminati could not yet see. The honest response to that knowledge would have been to disclose it, to tell the Avengers, to tell S.H.I.E.L.D., to tell whatever bodies were in a position to prepare for an infiltration the scope and nature of which they now had reason to suspect. The response they chose was different. They told each other what they knew. They expressed collectively the hope that the extraction process had not been as complete as it seemed, or that the Skrull technology was not yet sufficiently advanced to implement what the process had made possible, or that the warning itself had achieved its intended effect alongside everything else. They told themselves these things not because they believed them, but because the alternative, acknowledging that their intervention had made things dramatically worse, was the kind of thing that very capable men find, structurally, almost impossible to admit. The second CTA marker, for those listening on another device, find us on Spotify. The link is in the description. The years that followed were years of relative quiet on the Skrull front. This is the thing about time-delayed consequences. They feel, during the delay, like evidence that the concern was overblown. The Skrull Empire did not immediately attack. The infiltration program, if that was what had been initiated, produced no visible results in the months and then the years after the visit. The Illuminati continued to meet. They addressed other matters. They handled other threats. And in Skrull laboratories that no Earth-based intelligence had ever located, scientists worked by light that had no Earth-equivalent color, with DNA extracted from 5 of the most powerful beings on the planet, and they built the capacity to become them, not just to look like them, to be them, to walk among humanity wearing their faces and carrying their power, undetectable by any instrument Earth possessed. The warning the Illuminati had delivered had achieved precisely the opposite of its intended effect. It had given the Skrull Empire a map of exactly what it needed to defeat them, in the most complete and intimate terms possible. The visit had not warned the Skrulls away from Earth. It had handed them the keys. The Skrull Empress had a name in Skrull, a name in the old language that the Kree had never been able to fully transliterate, and that the few surface-world linguists who had attempted it had consistently rendered as approximately Varanki, though that rendering was approximate in the way that translations of old and particular languages are always approximate. She was not, by the standards of Skrull political history, an ideologue. She was a pragmatist in the specific mould of long-lived pragmatism, someone who had watched enough political cycles to have concluded that ideology was the privilege of people who were not yet responsible for outcomes. What she saw in the room when the Illuminati arrived was not an opportunity for diplomacy. It was an inventory. 5 beings of extraordinary capability in her space, within reach of her instruments. The warning they had delivered was noted. The data that their presence had made available was prioritized. She was, in the most practical sense, available to her, doing her job. The escape from the Skrull homeworld produced a specific kind of silence between the 5 members. Not the silence of people who have been through something together, but the silence of people who have been through something separately and are now sitting in the same space with the separate versions of it. Strange said at one point that he was not certain they had all experienced the same detention. He said this in the careful way he said things that had implications he was not yet prepared to fully state. Tony said that the telemetry suggested the ship's holding cells had been individually isolated, that the Skrull scientist had separated them specifically to prevent any collaborative response. Reed said that if that was the case, then the behavioral data the Skrulls had extracted was, in terms of individual sample integrity, exceptionally clean. No one followed up on what that meant. The silence that followed Reed's observation had a texture that was different from the silence before it, and they flew home in that texture. They flew home believing the mission had been a partial success, a warning delivered, even if the visit had been complicated. What they had actually done was plant a seed that would take 30 years to reach full growth. But seeds require patience, and the Skrulls were an empire that had been learning patience for a very long time. The Illuminati had other problems. Among them was the matter of the Infinity Gems, 6 objects of absolute power, scattered across the world after the events of the Infinity Gauntlet crisis, each one capable of being assembled with the others into the most destructive weapon the universe had ever produced. And the Council had a plan for those too. Take a moment here. Let your breath move more slowly. The story is entering a chapter that deserves a certain quiet, not because the events are quiet, but because what happened with the Infinity Gems is the kind of thing that only makes sense when you approach it without hurry, when you look at it steadily and resist the impulse to reach for an easy explanation. The Infinity Gauntlet crisis had demonstrated, with a thoroughness that no abstract argument could replicate, that the 6 Infinity Gems, soul, time, reality, power, space, and mind, represented the single greatest threat to all of existence that any individual could assemble. Thanos of Titan had assembled them. He had used them. He had, for a period that should not have been survivable, held the literal fabric of reality in his hand and shaped it according to his will, and the only reason anything remained afterward was a sequence of interventions so unlikely that calling it a plan would be generous. The gems had been redistributed after the crisis. They had been scattered. They existed in various hands, in various locations, in the vague hope that their separation was itself a kind of safety. The vague hope was not a plan. Tony Stark was constitutionally incapable of accepting vague hopes as plans, and in the months after the Illuminati's formation, he presented the Council with what he considered a genuine one. The problem with scattered gems, he argued, was that they could be gathered. Any sufficiently motivated individual with sufficient resources could, given time, locate and assemble all 6. The prevention of another Infinity Gauntlet crisis therefore required not just scattering but securing, and securing in a world where any single vault could be breached required distributing the gems among the 6 people least likely to be in the same place at the same time and most capable of defending their individual piece against any conceivable threat. He proposed that each member of the Illuminati take 1 gem, hold it, guard it, agree that no 2 gems would ever be in the same location simultaneously unless the full council had voted to temporarily assemble them for a specific and agreed-upon purpose. The council agreed, which is to say they agreed to agree, which is different from agreement in the way that an architectural model differs from a building. What followed was the hunt, the locating and acquiring of each gem from wherever the post-gauntlet redistribution had left it. Tony claimed the space gem, whose properties of dimensional manipulation aligned most directly with the technological architecture he worked in. Reed took the time gem and spent several weeks afterward in a state of focused distraction that Sue Richards later described, with the calm patience of someone accustomed to focused distraction, as particularly pronounced. Professor Xavier took the mind gem, reluctantly, because his expertise in psychic phenomena made him the most qualified steward, and also because the gem's existence in the hands of anyone else alarmed him more than its existence in his own. Namor was assigned the power gem, an assignment he accepted with a quiet that might have been philosophical acceptance, or might have been the precise silence of a man formulating a counter-argument he had not yet finished refining. Black Bolt received the reality gem, which seemed, in a way that no one said aloud, appropriate for a man whose very voice could unmake the world around him. Stephen Strange took the soul gem last, and the manner in which he took it, with both hands, carefully, and a particular steadiness of expression, suggested that the soul gem had already communicated something to him that he was not going to share. Sit with this for a moment. 6 gems, 6 men, 6 separate vaults distributed across the earth, the ocean floor, a Himalayan monastery, and the deep architecture of a mutant school in Westchester. The plan was elegant in the way plans are elegant before they encounter reality. The plan assumed that each of the 6 men would remain, indefinitely, capable of defending their gem, that none of them would be captured, compromised, incapacitated, or killed in ways that would put their gem in other hands, that none of them would, under pressure, decide that their gem was the thing that could solve a problem they had not anticipated, that the mere fact of the gem's separation was sufficient safety, and that safety required no more active management than that. The plan, in other words, assumed that the future would be kind enough to resemble the present. Namor's relationship with the power gem was not comfortable, and it did not become more comfortable with time. He visited it less often than the others visited theirs. He reported in the terse communiques that constituted his preferred mode of council communication that the gem was secure. He did not report, because the question was not asked, whether he had on some evenings sat in the vault and felt the thing pulse with a weight that was not physical, a weight that seemed, on those evenings, to be offering him something, and that he was declining, and that the declining required more effort than he was inclined to admit to people who had also declined. Strange's relationship with the soul gem was, by Strange's own later account, the most complex. The soul gem was not passive. Among the 6, the soul gem had the most persistent sense of having an opinion. Strange had spent his entire post-medical career navigating the landscape of things that had opinions while appearing not to. Demons that offered assistance, entities that accepted invitations, forces that took what was given and then kept giving in directions you had not authorized. He knew what the soul gem was doing when it pressed at the edges of his awareness, and he knew what the correct response to that pressure was. He responded correctly, most of the time. The soul gem accepted this with what Strange could only describe as patience, and patience in a cosmic artifact is not a reassuring quality. The broader flaw in the Council's gem distribution plan was one that none of them articulated, possibly because articulating it would have required acknowledging something they were not, as a group, inclined to acknowledge. The flaw was this: distributing the gems among themselves did not make the gems harder to assemble. It made them easier. Anyone who wanted to assemble the Infinity Gauntlet and was willing to approach the problem at the correct level of ambition no longer needed to search the world for 6 hidden objects of mysterious origin. They only needed to defeat, capture, or compromise 6 specific individuals whose names and powers were well documented in the files of every intelligence organization on Earth. The Illuminati, in trying to secure the gems, had created a single, coherent target that was the Illuminati itself. This was not a small error. It was the kind of error that brilliant people make when they are so focused on the elegance of their solution that they do not fully work through what they have changed. Before the Illuminati took the gems were distributed across the world in ways that reflected the chaos of the Gauntlet Crisis's resolution, scattered by circumstance, held by individuals and organizations with no common thread, protected by the simple difficulty of finding things that have no known location. After the Illuminati took the gems were distributed across 6 individuals whose locations were, in a world with SHIELD surveillance and Skrull infiltration programs, and any number of other intelligence-gathering operations, not truly secret at all. The chaos that had been a kind of accidental protection was replaced by an order that was a kind of inadvertent map. They did not see this at the time, or rather, they saw it in the way you see something when you are looking past it at something else. The Council's attention was elsewhere, on the Skrull situation, on the slow burn of mutant politics, on the catalogue of threats that the pooled intelligence of 6 extraordinary minds continued to surface. The gems were, for several years, a solved problem. They sat in their vaults, they pulsed in their quiet, patient ways, and the men who held them continued to meet and vote and make decisions about the world and grow incrementally more comfortable with the premise that their judgment was sufficient justification for those decisions. There is a kind of confidence that grows in the absence of consequences. The Illuminati, in the years after their founding, accumulated that confidence, the way a savings account accumulates interest. Slowly, invisibly, in a process that feels passive but is actually a form of growth. Each meeting that ended without disaster confirmed, to some portion of each member's thinking, that the Council's existence was working. Each threat that was identified and addressed before it reached crisis scale felt like evidence that the architecture Tony had proposed was sound. Each vote that was cast and then not reversed by subsequent events seemed like retroactive endorsement. The confidence was not entirely unfounded. The Illuminati did prevent things. There are events that did not happen because 5 men sat in a room and decided collectively to address them before they became visible to the broader world. The problem with preventing invisible things is that the prevention is also invisible, that the proof of the Council's effectiveness was, by definition, the absence of certain outcomes, and the absence of outcomes is a very difficult thing to weigh against the outcomes that the Council's existence produced. The weight of the prevented catastrophes and the weight of the created catastrophes existed in the same accounting, and no one was running the full accounting. Professor Xavier's experience of holding the Mind Gem was the most psychically complex of the 6, for reasons that the other members were not fully equipped to appreciate. The Mind Gem, in the framework of its operation, did not simply amplify the ability to read thoughts. It established a form of psychic contact with all minds simultaneously, not in the deliberate selective manner that Xavier's own gift permitted, but in a continuous, undifferentiated awareness that required constant active management to prevent from overwhelming the practitioner's individual identity. Xavier had spent his entire life managing a version of this. the background noise of 7 billion conscious beings, filtered to usability by the mental architecture he had spent decades refining. The mind gem was not filtered. Xavier described the experience in the private meditations he kept, and that were recovered after his death, as like standing in a room where every conversation in the world was being held simultaneously at full volume, and being required to conduct a specific conversation of your own within that noise, and maintaining this condition for years. He did not share this with the other members. He told them the gem was secure. It was technically true. The distribution of the gems changed the council in a way that was not immediately visible. Each member of the Illuminati had previously been someone who held specific power in a specific domain. Tony's technology, Reed's science, Strange's mystic authority, Black Bolt's voice, Namor's sovereignty, Xavier's telepathy. The gems did not replace these powers. They supplemented them. But the supplementation was not neutral. Holding an infinity gem was not simply holding an object. It was being in relationship with a force of reality-level significance, and that relationship, over months and then years, produced subtle adjustments in the thinking of each holder. Reed's relationship to time became more complex. Tony's sense of the spatial possibilities of any engineering problem became more expansive. These adjustments were small, and they were not dramatic, and no one discussed them. But they were real, and they were cumulative, and the person who held the time gem for long enough was not quite the same person who had first picked it up, in ways that were difficult to identify precisely because the changes occurred from the inside. The gems rested, the council met, the world continued, and in a room that Bruce Banner still did not know existed, a different kind of calculation was underway, one that involved not cosmic artifacts but a man and his condition and the probability distribution of his future behavior. The calculation had been running quietly as a background process in Tony Stark's thinking for longer than he would later admit. He was not, he would have told you, looking forward to the conversation it would eventually require. But he would have told you also that the conversation was necessary, that the numbers demanded it, that the council existed precisely to make the decisions that individuals with emotional involvement could not make alone. He believed this. It was one of the things about the Illuminati that was true. It was also one of the things about the Illuminati that made it dangerous. Breathe. This chapter is the one the cold open promised, and it is worth approaching slowly. Not because the events are difficult to follow, but because the easiest way to understand what happened to Bruce Banner is to resist the urge to assign blame too quickly, and to sit instead with the fact that what the Illuminati did to him was done by people who knew him. Tony Stark had known Bruce Banner for years before the Illuminati formed. He had worked alongside him. He had talked to him in the quiet way that two scientists talk when they are in the same room with a problem neither of them has solved, the shorthand that develops between people who think in similar registers, even when those registers produce very different results. Reed Richards had known Bruce longer. Strange had treated him twice, in contexts that he described in the Council's records only as medically significant. The men who sat around the table to discuss Bruce Banner were not strangers looking at a file. They were people looking at a person, and what they were deciding was not an abstraction. The precipitating event was Las Vegas. The version of the Hulk that emerged during what the Council's subsequent briefings referred to as the Las Vegas incident was not the Hulk at his theoretical worst. The Hulk at his theoretical worst existed in projections and simulations, and for Reed, in a set of calculations that he kept in a file he had never shown anyone. The Las Vegas incident was the Hulk at a level of destructive output that the existing response infrastructure had handled barely, at a cost of significant structural damage and 26 verified casualties. 26. The number was specific, and Tony knew it precisely, and he introduced it into the Council's deliberations with the care of a man who understood that specific numbers, in discussions of this kind, did the emotional work that general concerns could not. The meeting that followed had a quality that distinguished it from every previous council session. Every previous session had involved threat analysis, the identification and assessment of external dangers, forces and factions from outside the membership that required coordinated response. This session was different. This session was about a member of a community they all belonged to, a hero, a person in the world of heroes, someone whose file in every relevant database read as ally, not enemy. The discomfort in the room was not hidden, because the Illuminati did not, among themselves, perform comfort they did not feel. They were too intelligent for that particular social reflex. The discomfort sat at the table alongside everything else. Tony's analysis was methodical, and in the manner of methodical analyses, more difficult to argue with than a passionate one. He had run the casualty projections for every recorded Hulk emergence over the preceding decade. He had modelled the trajectory, the incremental increase in both frequency and destructive output that the data, fairly read, suggested was continuing. He had calculated the probability of a future incident producing casualties, not in the dozens but in the hundreds, the thousands. He had looked at every containment methodology that had been tried and noted, with the precision of a man who'd been involved in several of them, that they had all eventually failed. He had consulted Reed's calculations, which arrived at similar conclusions by different mathematical routes, and Strange's assessments, which described the mystic containment protocols as having diminishing marginal effectiveness with each application. He had, in other words, done the work of someone trying to make a decision rather than justify one he had already made. He believed the numbers. This made it worse. Reed's contribution to the discussion was not primarily argumentative, it was structural. He laid out, on a screen that showed the relevant orbital mechanics, the parameters of what he called an alternative placement, a world in another star system, at a distance sufficient to make return without external assistance effectively impossible, with an environmental profile conducive to long-term human survival, and with no indigenous population of sufficient social complexity to be meaningfully disrupted by a new arrival. He had identified the world. He had calculated the transit time. He had designed, in the preceding weeks, a ship capable of making the journey. He presented these things with a particular quietness that Reed Richards brought to the presentation of things he found genuinely difficult to have thought through. Strange spoke briefly. He said that he'd exhausted the inventory of mystic interventions that might address the core problem rather than its symptoms. He said this without elaboration, which was, for Strange, a kind of emphasis. He said that he did not love the proposal on the table, and that he could not, in honesty, articulate a better one. Black Bolt voted first, as he most often did when the council was deliberating a matter of extraordinary weight. The convention had developed naturally, because Black Bolt's vote, expressed through the Royal Inhumans sign language that Strange had learned and the others had studied, carried a quality of finality that set a tone. He voted yes. Namor was silent for a long time. He said eventually that he wanted the record, the internal record that they kept nowhere but in their own memories, to reflect that this was not a decision he made without reservation. Then he voted yes. They wrote the letter together. This is a detail that deserves attention. They did not delegate the letter to Tony, who had been the primary advocate for the decision. They wrote it together, each contributing language, each reading what the others had written and revising and reading again. The letter, as it eventually read, told Bruce Banner that the men who had sent him into space were his friends, that they had done what they had done because they believed with genuine conviction that the life they were sending him toward was better, safer, quieter, and more suited to the version of Bruce Banner that existed when the Hulk was not involved than any life available to him on Earth. The letter said that they loved him, in the way that word is used when it's being asked to carry more weight than it can comfortably hold. The letter did not say, "We voted." It did not say, "The margin was not unanimous." It did not say, "We decided this without asking you, because we believed our judgment was more reliable than your autonomy." Banner was in the adjacent room. The adjacent room had a window that looked out on a courtyard where pigeons were doing what pigeons do in courtyards, moving in small, purposeless bursts, pecking at things that may or may not have been worth pecking at. He had been told there was a technical issue with the meeting secure communications and that Tony would be with him shortly. He was thinking about a problem in particle physics. This is documented in the account he gave later, during the events called World War Hulk, when he had access to his own memory of the day and the particular quality of attention that accompanies the end of a long and patient anger. He said he had been thinking about quarks. He had been thinking about the behavior of matter at the scale where behavior became strange and the rules changed, and he had been comfortable in the thinking, which was the kind of comfortable Bruce Banner most reliably found, inside a problem that was not about him. The shuttle that carried Bruce Banner into space was designed by Reed Richards and built in a facility that had no public existence. It was equipped with life support systems capable of sustaining a human passenger for the duration of the transit, provisions for a longer stay if the transit calculations proved imprecise, and a navigation system programmed for the agrarian world Reed had identified. The navigation system failed within 48 hours of launch, or more precisely something in the interaction between the navigation programming and Banner's specific physiology produced an outcome the programming had not anticipated, and the ship deviated from its projected course. The deviation was significant. The world the ship eventually reached was not the quiet agrarian settlement Reed had chosen. It was a place called Sakaar. The Illuminati learned about the deviation before the ship reached Sakaar. They received the telemetry. They saw the course correction. They had the capacity at that point in the trajectory to override the ship's navigation and redirect it to the original destination. The reason they did not is not clearly documented in any account, because the decision not to intervene was not made explicitly. It was made by the silence that fell over the discussion of the deviation, by the shared calculation, never stated aloud, that the course change had taken the matter outside the territory of their direct control, and that there was a kind of resolution in that, however uncomfortable. They did not chase the ship. They told each other, in the minimal language that the Council used for the things it did not want to examine, too directly, that the situation was developing and that they would monitor. They monitored from a distance that grew with each passing month more comfortable. Banner arrived on Sakaar. The early reports, gathered from sources that preferred not to be named in any account, suggested that he was surviving, then that he was more than surviving, then that the specific qualities of Sakaar's culture and the specific qualities of the Hulk's power in Sakaar's gravity and atmospheric conditions had produced something that the Illuminati's projections had not modelled. The Hulk was not rampaging on Sakaar. The Hulk was building something. The Hulk was, in a way that should have been impossible given the parameters of the Exile as the Council had conceived it, becoming a person. The silence that settled over the Illuminati's awareness of this information was different from the comfortable silence of not having to think about the matter. It was the silence of something growing in the dark, something that was given time and distance and the specific conditions of a world that had not been chosen for him, and that was growing, in those conditions, into something the original vote had not accounted for. The Council continued to meet. They continued to address other matters. The question of Bruce Banner existed in the margins of every session, noted, monitored, and not discussed in the depth that its trajectory deserved, because discussing it in that depth would have required discussing the decision itself, and the decision was made, and the Council did not, as a governing philosophy, revisit made decisions without new evidence that the decision had been wrong. The letter the Illuminati wrote to Bruce Banner is, in the accounts of those who have seen it, one of the most revealing documents the Council ever produced, not because of what it contained, but because of what it chose not to contain. It did not mention the vote. It did not say that 5 men had deliberated over his life and arrived at a decision in his absence. It described the choice to send him to another world as something closer to a gift, an opportunity curated by people who knew him well enough to know what he had always wanted, which was peace, and which was a world where the Hulk was not necessary, and which was a place where Bruce Banner could be a person rather than a problem. The letter was written with care. Every member of the council read it and revised it. They were all, in their different ways, gifted with language, or at minimum with the ability to deploy intelligence in the construction of sentences that said what needed to be said, while leaving unsaid what could not be said, without confronting the nature of what they had done. The letter was, by any reasonable standard, beautifully written. It was also, by the standard it was eventually judged by, the standard of a man who had been betrayed and who read it knowing he had been betrayed. A document that revealed not cruelty but something more uncomfortable. The self-portrait of people who believed so completely in the goodness of their intentions that they did not notice the intentions had ceased to be the point. Sakaar was not what Reed had modelled. The agrarian world he had identified, a planet with low population density, adequate atmospheric composition for human survival, and no advanced military capability, was the world the shuttle's navigation had been programmed to reach. Sakaar had a different atmospheric profile, a different gravitational constant, and a political history that had produced a specific kind of gladiatorial culture in which the Hulk's particular combination of physical power and emotional damage was not a liability, but a resource. The world that had been chosen for Bruce Banner would have given him the quiet life the letter described. The world he actually reached gave him something different, a test, and then a war, and then, briefly, improbably, in a way none of the Council's projections had anticipated, a kingdom. The Illuminati had tried to find him a world that was safe. He had found, in the world their navigation failure gave him, a world that made him capable. The distance between those two things was, eventually, World War Hulk. The new evidence arrived, eventually, in the form of a black box signal from the original shuttle, recovered on Sakaar's surface, and eventually transmitted. The signal contained the letter. The Illuminati had sent the letter with Banner, though they had told themselves it was a kindness, an explanation, a context, a gesture toward honesty, if not toward consultation. Banner read the letter on Sakaar, where he had become something the Council had not planned for him to become, surrounded by a people who had come to call him king. And the Hulk, who remembered things that Bruce Banner tried to forget, who carried in his enormous green frame the full weight of every abandonment and dismissal and judgment that the human world had made of the man he shared a body with. The Hulk read the letter too. The Hulk was not interested in forgiveness. The Hulk had begun, with the patient and methodical intelligence that the Illuminati had never fully credited him with, to plan a return. Let your body be heavy. Let the weight of where you are settle into you. You're still here, and this part of the story is the part that asks the most of those who are listening, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most familiar. This is the chapter where the Council, which was built to prevent catastrophe, watched one arrive and found itself on both sides of it. The Superhero Registration Act was not an accident. It was the product of a long accumulation of incidents, of property damage and civilian casualties, and the particular cultural anxiety that develops in a society that lives alongside people with the power to destroy cities, and that has never been given a formal mechanism for influencing how that power is deployed. The Stamford disaster, the explosion that killed 600 people, including 60 children from a local school during an engagement between the New Warriors and a group of supervillains who had been cornered in a residential area, was not the cause of the Registration Act. It was the moment when public opinion, which had been moving toward the Act for years, arrived at its destination and stopped being ambiguous. The Illuminati met before the public debate fully crystallized. This was their mode, to identify the shape of a crisis before it became a crisis, to develop a position before positions hardened into sides. Tony called the meeting. He came with an analysis that he described, with his characteristic directness, as uncomfortable but clear. The Registration Act, he told the Council, was going to pass. Not might pass, would pass. The political mathematics were not close, and once it passed, every unregistered superhuman in the country would face a choice between compliance and criminality, and the heroes who had spent their lives working alongside government structures without formally being answerable to them would find themselves on the wrong side of a law that the majority of the public supported. Tony's position was that the intelligent response to this was not to fight the act but to shape it, to engage with the legislative process, to push for protections, to turn a bad law into a workable one. Reed's analysis corroborated Tony's at the mathematical level. He had modelled the social dynamics with the particular thoroughness he brought to everything, and the model was not encouraging to the side that wanted to fight. The public support for some form of accountability was real and deep, and not primarily driven by fear of superhumans, as some of the opposition argued, but by something more durable, a democratic intuition that power without accountability was a structural problem regardless of whether the people holding the power were good people. Reed found this intuition, in his way, reasonable. He also found the Stanford casualty figure difficult to argue against, without seeming to argue for the deaths themselves. Strange said very little, which was its own position. The Sorcerer Supreme occupied a relationship to political structures that was genuinely distinct from any of the others. The mystic arts existed in a framework that predated the nation-state and would outlast it, and Strange's primary accountability was to the maintenance of dimensional and cosmic barriers that most politicians did not know existed. He was not indifferent to the political question. He simply had difficulty accepting, at a foundational level, that it applied to him in the way it applied to Tony and Reed, and he said so with the particular courtesy that Strange brought to honest disagreements. Namor's position was structurally similar to Strange's, but arrived at differently. Namor did not recognize the jurisdiction of any surface world government over his person, his actions, or the actions of his subjects. He said this with the calm that characterizes individuals who genuinely believe in the thing they are saying rather than performing it for effect. He also said that the act, if passed, would produce exactly the kind of escalation it claimed to prevent, that forcing heroes underground was not accountability but provocation. And he said this with the calm of someone who had lived through enough political cycles to have watched this particular dynamic unfold before. They agreed to invite Steve Rogers. This decision, in retrospect, was the Council's clearest demonstration of the gap between its self-image and its actual function. The invitation was framed as consultation, as the Illuminati bringing another perspective to the table, broadening the discussion. The implicit assumption beneath that framing was that Rogers, once exposed to the full analysis, might be persuaded. The assumption behind that assumption was that the Illuminati's analysis was so thorough and their reasoning so sound that resistance to it represented either incomplete information or emotional interference. Tony believed this, in the particular way that people believe things when the belief is consistent with everything they already know about themselves. Rogers arrived at the meeting location with the directness that characterized everything he did. No theatre, no performance. A man who had learned, across decades of conflict, to conserve the energy he did not need for what he might. He listened to the presentation. He asked questions that were precise and pointed in the way that questions are when they come from someone who has already identified the place where the argument is weakest. He was not dismissive or contemptuous. He was engaged, genuinely and thoroughly, and the engagement made his eventual response harder to hear than dismissal would have been. Sit with this for a moment. Rogers' argument against registration, against the Illuminati's position, was not primarily moral. Or rather, it was moral, but the moral content was embedded in a structural observation that the Council's own logic should have caught but hadn't. Rogers said that the problem with the Registration Act was not that accountability was wrong. Accountability was right. The problem was that the Act proposed to route that accountability through the government rather than through the conscience of the individual, and that there was a specific, well-documented historical pattern of what happened when the consciences of individuals who were doing the right thing were replaced by the directives of governments who were pursuing other agendas. Rogers had spent enough time in the 20th century to have case studies. He listed some of them. The room was quiet while he listed them. He left. He did not storm out. There was no drama, no door slamming, no declaration. He simply said that he had heard the arguments, that he respected the intelligence of the people in the room, and that he disagreed with them, and that he was going to act on that disagreement. The men who remained watched him go with a particular look of people who are certain they are right, and equally certain that something has just gone wrong. The civil war that followed is documented in histories that run to thousands of pages, and it is not the purpose of this account to reproduce it. What is relevant here is what the war did to the Illuminati, which was essentially dissolve it. Tony was the primary architect of the pro-registration side. Reed supported registration without leading the campaign. Strange declared formal neutrality and withdrew. Namor returned to Atlantis. Xavier, who had watched the political treatment of mutants long enough to have developed a sophisticated immunity to optimism, was silent in the ways that matter more than speech. The council stopped meeting. There was nothing to vote on that they could have voted on together, because the question that mattered most was the question on which they had stopped being a unified body. The Illuminati had been formed to prevent exactly this kind of fracture, to provide a mechanism for coordination before the moment of crisis rather than scrambling after it. But the thing it turned out they could not coordinate was themselves. They could pool intelligence about alien invasions. They could agree to send a man into space. They could vote on the disposition of cosmic artifacts. They could not agree about what kind of world they were doing all of it to protect. And that disagreement turned out to be the one that mattered most. The war ended. The specific mechanism of its ending, the revelation that involved a series of events too complex to compress fairly, left the political landscape significantly altered. Tony Stark became the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. The Registration Act was law. The heroes who had opposed it were either registered, underground, or scattered. And something that had been building for several decades in laboratories that no Illuminati intelligence report had ever fully located was ready, or nearly ready, to emerge. There is a particular irony in the timing. The Illuminati had fractured over a political question about accountability and oversight at precisely the moment when the consequence of their earlier unaccountable decision was maturing into a crisis. The Skrull infiltration program, initiated by the Capture during their warning visit, and developed over 30 years in the specific terms that the Illuminati's own DNA had made possible, was now embedded at the deepest levels of every institution the heroes relied on. The fracture that the Civil War had produced meant that the response infrastructure for a coordinated alien threat was in precisely the weakest condition it had been in since the Kree-Skrull War itself. It was as if something had known the right moment to arrive. The argument between Rogers and the Illuminati had a specific texture that is worth attending to, because it was not the argument of people talking past each other. They were not, in the moments of that meeting, misunderstanding each other. They were understanding each other very well, and disagreeing about what the understanding required. Tony understood what Rogers was saying about accountability, and about the historical pattern of governments misusing the authority over extraordinary individuals. Rogers understood what Tony was saying about the political inevitability of the act, and the practical benefit of shaping bad legislation rather than losing control of it entirely. The disagreement was not about facts. It was about which facts were the load-bearing ones, about which thread, when pulled, revealed the shape of the thing. Rogers thought the thread was the one about conscience. Tony thought the thread was the one about outcomes. Neither of them was wrong to think what he thought. That is the specific quality of the Civil War's foundational disagreement. It was a genuine philosophical division between people who had both done the reasoning, and the reasoning had led them to different places, and there was no meta-argument available that resolved it, without simply asserting one set of premises over the other. Strange's neutrality during the Civil War was not passivity, and it is worth being precise about that distinction. Strange was not absent from the world during the conflict. He was present in a different register, the mystic register, which operated in a framework that the Civil War's political and physical dimensions could not fully reach. The conflicts he was managing during the Civil War period were dimensional and existential in ways that had no political expression, an incursion of demonic entities through a fracture in the New York dimensional substrate, a temporal crisis in the California nexus, the slow deterioration of 3 specific mystic barriers that had been holding since the 40s, and that required the Sorcerer Supreme's direct attention to maintain. Strange kept these from the other Illuminati members, because sharing them would have required explaining why he was not more engaged with the conflict they were in the middle of, and explaining that would have required a longer conversation about the relationship between the mystic framework and the political one than anyone had time for. The world he was managing was invisible to the world that was fighting. He managed it alone, and the managing cost him things that did not show up in any of the Civil War's accounting. Perhaps something had. The Illuminati, scattered now, operating in the diminished register of people whose shared project has been interrupted rather than concluded, would not have the luxury of approaching the next crisis with the clarity of distance. The next crisis was already inside the walls. The warning they had delivered on the Skrull homeworld 30 years before was about to mature into the war they had flown across the galaxy to prevent. And the tools they had trusted to prevent it, the Council, the secrecy, the pooled intelligence, the certainty of their own judgment, were unavailable because they had spent them on each other. Breathe. The story moves now into its most painful chapter, the one where the seeds planted earliest produced their fullest harvest. You do not need to follow every detail. The outline of what happened is enough, and the outline is simple in the way that consequences are always simple when you can see where they began. Secret Invasion arrived not as an attack, but as a revelation. The Skrull infiltration, which had been building across decades in the specific biological and behavioral terms made possible by the Illuminati's captured DNA, had reached into every significant superhuman organization on Earth. S.H.I.E.L.D. was compromised. The Avengers roster contained replacements that had operated undetected through the Civil War and before. The Baxter Building had been mapped from the inside by a mind that was using Reed Richards's face. Specific individuals who had participated in specific operations at specific moments of critical vulnerability had been, at those moments, Skrulls. The scale of the infiltration was not, even now, completely known. Some of the replacements are still disputed. The Illuminati learned the scope in stages, which is the particular cruelty of how revelations of this kind work. Not all at once, which would at least have the quality of a complete picture, but piece by piece, with each piece requiring the revision of everything the previous piece had seemed to establish. Black Bolt, it emerged, had been replaced before the Council's most recent sessions. The Black Bolt who had voted in those sessions, who had voted for certain decisions that the Council had then implemented, had been a Skrull. The specific decisions he had voted on, and the question of whether the Skrull's vote would have differed from the genuine Boltagon's vote, became one of those questions that cannot be answered cleanly, and that nonetheless shapes everything. The invasion itself, the active phase, the ships visible in the sky over New York and elsewhere, the Skrull ground forces using faces that the heroes recognized, lasted days. It was resolved not by the coordinated response of a standing council with pooled intelligence and established protocols, because that council no longer existed. It was resolved by the chaotic, improvised response of heroes who were fighting people who looked like their allies, in a conflict where the ability to trust the person standing next to you had been systematically removed. The resolution came through a series of events that depended heavily on luck, on the specific individual decisions of people who were operating without coordination, and on one particular moment in which Norman Osborn, the villain, the criminal, the man who had spent years in prison for the things he had done, fired the shot that ended the active phase, Osborn killed the Skrull Queen. He did this publicly, on camera, in a manner that was impossible to misread as ambiguous. The political consequences were immediate and enormous. The director of S.H.I.E.L.D., who had been Tony Stark, who had built the registration infrastructure on the premise that accountability would produce a safer world, was removed. The infrastructure itself was dissolved. The organization that replaced it was Hammer, and Norman Osborn became its director. Dark Reign, as the period that followed came to be called, was the direct political consequence of the Illuminati's greatest collective failure. Tony Stark's response to Dark Reign was among the most significant things he ever did, and it is also among the most telling about the architecture of his thinking. He could not, under the circumstances, simply hand Osborn the S.H.I.E.L.D. database. The accumulated intelligence of the world's most comprehensive spy organization, containing the identities, locations, capabilities, and vulnerabilities of every superhuman the organization had ever tracked. He could not destroy it cleanly because the data was distributed across systems that were already in the process of being transferred to Hammer's control. The solution he arrived at was to destroy his own mind. He infected himself with a degenerative virus, a piece of code that systematically corrupted his own neural architecture, working outward from the most recently encoded memories toward the foundational ones, erasing the S.H.I.E.L.D. database as it went. He did this knowing that the process was likely irreversible. He did it anyway, and the Illuminati did not stop him, because the Illuminati no longer had the standing to stop him, because the Illuminati had ceased to function as a council, and had become instead a collection of individuals dealing separately with the consequences of decisions they had made together. Reed Richards returned to the Baxter Building, and the only mode he had reliably maintained across every crisis in his life: work. He did not retreat from intellectual engagement with the world's problems. He retreated from the particular form of collaborative engagement that the Illuminati represented, at least temporarily, and worked in the register of a man who had concluded that the problem he needed to solve was more fundamental than any specific threat, that what had failed was not the intelligence or the intentions of the people in the room, but something structural about the system they had built. His papers from this period, many of which were never published, contain extensive modelling of what he called institutional epistemic failure, which is a scientific way of describing what T'Challa had described much more directly in the room where the council was formed. Strange lost the title of Sorcerer Supreme during this period, in circumstances that were connected to the broader collapse of the superhuman infrastructure, and that he had, in some sense, been anticipating. The loss was not a catastrophe for Strange in the personal terms one might have expected, or rather, it was a different kind of catastrophe than expected, a quiet one. He had known for some time that the bargains he had made in the service of the Council's broader work had cost him something that was difficult to name precisely because it concerned the mystic dimension, where precise naming was always an approximation. The loss of the title clarified something he had been suspending judgment on. He was no longer the Sorcerer Supreme. He was simply Stephen Strange, who knew a great deal and had spent it on things he was not certain had deserved it. Namor navigated the period between Dark Reign's beginning and its end, with the particular efficiency of someone who had outlived enough political regimes to understand them as weather. He was not indifferent to the catastrophe. He was realistic about it, and his realism expressed itself as continued engagement with the specific problems that the catastrophe presented: the rebuilding of Atlantean infrastructure, the monitoring of surface world political development, the maintenance of the relationships that would be necessary when the regime changed, as regimes always changed. He did not stop thinking about the Illuminati during this period. He thought about what the Council had built, and what it had failed to protect, and whether the failure was a reason to abandon the architecture or to rebuild it on different terms. The second Spotify moment, for those listening in the dark, if you would rather close your eyes entirely, find us on Spotify. The link is in the description. The question of what the Illuminati had done, what their specific decisions had contributed to the sequence of events that ended with Norman Osborn in charge of the world's most powerful intelligence organization, was not a question any of them answered publicly. It existed in the private accounting that each of them carried. Tony's accounting, to the extent that it could be reconstructed from what he said and wrote in the period before the virus completed its work on his memory, was the most direct. He knew what the Skrull visit had contributed. He knew what the gem distribution had enabled. He knew what the exile of Bruce Banner had produced, because World War Hulk had happened while the Illuminati was still nominally a functioning council, had produced casualties and structural damage in New York that had contributed to the political climate that enabled the Registration Act, had killed Ares and left scars in the city's fabric that had not fully healed. The thing about consequences at this scale is that they are not experienced as a list. They are experienced as an environment, a steady-state reality that shapes every subsequent decision without announcing itself as the product of prior ones. The Illuminati, in the Dark Reign period, were not sitting in rooms discussing their failures. They were surviving in a world that their failures had made. They were making new decisions in response to problems their old decisions had created, without always being able to see the chain clearly enough to break it. Osborn's reign ended, as all such regimes do, in overreach. The siege of Asgard, which Osborn orchestrated and which produced a response from multiple directions that his infrastructure was not equipped to manage, effectively concluded Dark Reign and began the period of slow reconstruction that would eventually allow the Avengers to reassemble in something closer to their original form. Tony Stark was found in a hospital in Australia, with the degenerative process arrested at a level of memory loss that had returned him to a significantly earlier version of himself. He would recover. The recovery would take time, and the version of Tony that emerged from it would not have all the memories of the decisions the Illuminati had made, which was a kind of mercy and also a kind of liability. The Council did not formally reconvene during this period. There was no vote to suspend operations. There was simply the cessation of meetings, the drift of 5 extraordinary people into their separate recoveries, and the quiet that accumulates between people who have shared something they cannot fully discuss. The world continued without the Illuminati managing it, and the world was neither dramatically better nor dramatically worse than it had been with the Illuminati managing it, which was itself a kind of verdict. Norman Osborn's period of power produced a specific kind of fear that was different from the fear produced by alien invasions or cosmic crises. Those fears were large and visible, and large visible fears have a quality that, paradoxically, makes them easier to respond to. They are legible, they are external, they have faces and names and movement that can be tracked. Osborn's power was institutional. It wore the face of legitimacy. It operated through structures that had been built to protect people and that could, by a specific manipulation of their authority, be turned to pursue them instead. The Illuminati, in the Dark Reign period, understood this in a way that each of them had understood it before in different contexts. Strange had encountered demonic entities that operated by wearing the faces of trusted things. Tony had spent years inside corporate structures that served one stated purpose and one actual purpose, and managed the gap between them with paperwork. Reed had modelled social systems that could be weaponized by whoever controlled the modelling parameters. They were not individually naive about institutional corruption. What they had not anticipated was being its primary targets, because they had spent their entire careers on the inside of the institutions, adjacent to the decisions shaping the parameters, comfortable enough in the machinery that its capacity to turn against them had remained theoretical. The question of what the Illuminati left behind when it scattered, when Tony was erasing his mind and Reed was retreating into calculation, and Strange was managing his mystic bargains, and Namor was navigating Atlantean politics, and Xavier was doing whatever Xavier does at the edge of things. was not a question anyone was in a position to ask at the time, but it is answerable in retrospect, and the answer is this. It left behind a gap, not a vacuum. The world had other heroes, other teams, other systems of protection. But a gap in the specific form of coordination that the Council had provided. The gap was not primarily about intelligence pooling or resource sharing or any of the practical functions the Council had served. It was about the specific agreement to be honest with each other in a room that no one else could see. When the Council was gone, there was no such room. The heroes who might have built something similar were too dispersed, too suspicious of each other after the Civil War, too depleted by the secret invasion's revelations to trust the kind of closed architecture the Illuminati represented. The gap, therefore, was also a silence, and things grow in silences. The incursion crisis grew in this one, but the world had changed in ways that the existing accounting did not fully capture. In the years since the Illuminati's founding, in the space created by their decisions and their failures, and the cascading consequences of both, the universe itself had developed a new problem. The problem was not political. It was not social. It was not the kind of problem that any intelligence operation or coordinated response, or even the most brilliant council of extraordinary minds could have seen coming, because it came from outside the framework that all of those things operated in. It came from the structure of reality itself, which had begun to crack, and which was cracking in a specific location. The Earth, always the Earth, the pivot point of every cosmic drama the universe had ever staged. The walls between worlds were thinning, and the first person to notice was not a member of the Illuminati. She arrived from somewhere else entirely, carrying the news like something she had survived. Breathe slowly now. Let the breath arrive and leave without effort. This chapter is the one where the scale changes, where the story expands beyond the politics of a single world and into something older and stranger and more patient. Let that expansion happen without resistance. You do not need to follow every coordinate. The shape of what happened is what matters. The woman who called herself the Black Swan arrived on Earth 616, the Earth that anchored the Marvel Universe's primary continuity, without announcement and without the kind of dramatic staging that arrivals of genuine consequence usually produced. She arrived in a field in Wakanda, by the account of the people who found her, at a moment when the field was otherwise unoccupied. She was not injured in any way that could be identified by conventional medicine. She was carrying what a subsequent analysis identified as the destruction of a world, specifically the psychic residue of a planetary-scale annihilation event, the kind that leaves marks in the aura of anyone who was present for it. She had been present for it. She had, in fact, caused it, because she had seen what was coming and concluded that causing it was less terrible than what would have happened otherwise. What was coming, what had been coming for some time, across a multiverse that was older and stranger than even the Illuminati's most comprehensive threat mapping had accounted for, was the phenomenon that would later be called incursions. The concept required a specific kind of cosmological imagination to grasp, and it is worth describing carefully. In the structure of the Marvel multiverse, each universe occupies a distinct position in what the cosmologists who study such things call the omniverse. Each universe contains, at its center, a specific fixed point, and that fixed point in every universe that had ever been mapped or theorized was the Earth. The Earth was not the center of the universe because of human significance. It was the center because of something older, a convergence of energies and histories and possibilities that had made Earth, across every iteration of the multiverse, the place where things happened. An incursion occurred when the fixed points of two universes, two Earths, approached each other across the dimensional barrier that separated them. The approach was not metaphorical. It was literal, spatial, and measurable. The two Earths would eventually occupy the same dimensional space, and when they did, the result was the mutual destruction of both universes involved. The only way to prevent this was to destroy one of the two Earths before the collision. which would collapse the incursion, preserve the surviving universe, and destroy the universe whose Earth had been sacrificed. The Black Swan had destroyed her universe's Earth to save her own. She had watched her world die to save her world, and she had then crossed into a universe where the process was beginning again, and she had come to Wakanda because Wakanda was the most likely place to find someone intelligent enough to understand what she was saying. T'Challa understood. He brought it to the Avengers. The Avengers brought it to the collection of people with the intellectual and physical resources to engage with a problem of this scale, which, in the practical terms of who was available and functional in the post-Dark Reign period, meant the Illuminati. Not the original configuration. Professor Xavier's recent death had created a vacancy that Hank McCoy, the Beast, filled, bringing a scientific mind of a different order and a moral intuition that had been shaped by decades of witnessing what happened when power operated without conscience. And T'Challa himself was there. Finally, the man who had declined the original invitation on principled grounds, and who now joined because the problem in front of them was the kind that made principles about secret councils feel, if not irrelevant, then at least insufficient. The Illuminati reassembled. The room was different. The dynamic was different. The years between the founding meeting and this one had accumulated weight, in losses, in failures, in the specific knowledge that the Council had contributed to some of the worst outcomes of the intervening period. But the structure reassembled because the problem demanded it, and because the alternative was to face an existential threat without the coordinated intelligence that the original Tony Stark insight had been about. They sat at a table that was in a different location from the original. The table was the same in everything that mattered. Sit with this moment. These were not naive men. They knew what the Council had done. They knew what it had failed to do. They knew, or suspected, or chose not to ask the question clearly enough to have to know, that reassembling it on essentially the same terms as before was a decision that would produce at least some of the same failure modes. They chose to reassemble anyway, because the incursion crisis was real, because the Black Swan's data was verified by Reed's independent calculations and Strange's interdimensional mapping and Tony's satellite arrays, because a threat that threatened to destroy everything, not just Earth, but every Earth in every universe systematically, was not a threat they could wait for a better solution to before engaging. They had been here before, in a sense, at the table, with the problem, with the certainty that the problem required them specifically. The difference was that this time the problem was objectively real and existentially absolute. There was no version of the incursion crisis in which doing nothing was an acceptable strategy. Reed built the weapon first. He did not announce it or bring it to a vote. He built it because the mathematics of the situation suggested that a weapon capable of destroying a planet would be required, and because he was a man who, when the mathematics of a situation suggested something, moved toward that something with the focus of someone who does not need to think twice about whether the movement is correct. The antimatter injector was elegant in the specific way that solutions to problems you cannot afford to get wrong are elegant. It was direct, it was reliable, and it accomplished exactly one thing. It could destroy an Earth. That was what it was for. He presented it to the Council with a particular quietness that he brought to the presentation of things he found genuinely difficult to have thought through, and the Council looked at it in the specific silence of people who recognized something they had known was coming. The first vote on whether to use the weapon failed to reach consensus. The specific configuration of the vote is not on record. The Illuminati maintained no written records by design, but the accounts of the members suggest that the failure to reach consensus was not close. Multiple members declined to vote yes. The reasoning varied. T'Challa said that the question required more deliberation than the weapon's existence had allowed. Strange said that the mystic implications of deliberately destroying an inhabited world were not fully understood, and that deploying the weapon without that understanding was a risk he was not prepared to authorize. Tony said yes. Reed said yes. Namor said yes, with a particular expression that suggested his yes was more complicated than its surface appearance. The incursion in question resolved without the weapon's use. The other Earth, the approaching Earth from the colliding universe, was already in the late stages of ecological collapse, uninhabited in the technical sense of the word. The collapse completed itself before the collision point was reached, and the incursion ended without the Illuminati having to make the decision they had just failed to agree on. This outcome was experienced collectively as a reprieve, a brief one. The calculations suggested the next incursion would arrive in weeks, not months. The calculations also suggested that the proportion of incursing Earths that were uninhabited was very small. The Infinity Gems did not survive the first incursion. The specific mechanism by which the gems were destroyed, the interaction between the incursion event's dimensional energies and the gem's own reality-level properties, was something that Reed's models had not predicted, and it constituted one of the more comprehensive failures of his life's theoretical work, which he processed by spending 4 days in silence following the event, by his own account working through what the failure implied for the rest of the calculations. The gems were gone. The system of distributed security that the Council had spent years maintaining was gone. The fallback position, the option of using the assembled gauntlet as a deterrent or tool in an incursion crisis, was gone. They were, in the particular way that people who have relied on a safety net are when the safety net is removed, more exposed than they had been for a very long time. The machines they built after the gem loss were the logical extension of the weapon Reed had already created. If one injector was a deterrent, multiple injectors were a policy. The Council authorized construction in facilities that were distributed, hidden, and dedicated solely to this purpose. The industrial production of devices designed to destroy inhabited worlds, kept in storage, waiting for the vote that had not yet been possible. They told themselves that the machines were a deterrent. They told themselves that building the capacity to act was different from committing to act. They had told themselves similar things before, that the distributed gems were a safety measure rather than a concentrated target, that the Skrull visit was a warning rather than an information transfer, that the exile of Bruce Banner was a kindness rather than an abdication. The machines were built in the same quiet manner that the original Council had been built, in places without addresses, by people who understood the full purpose and chose not to discuss it. The world outside did not know they existed. The heroes outside the Council did not know they existed. Steve Rogers, who had been invited to the Council's first incursion meeting and had been briefly a member before the vote that removed him, did not know they existed. He had known the Council existed. He had known the Illuminati was operational again. He had not known when he attended that first incursion meeting what the Council was preparing to build. When he found out, when he voted against the weapon and against the direction the Council was moving, and the Council voted to remove him from the meeting and remove the memory of the meeting from his mind using the last assembled Infinity Gauntlet before its destruction, he would not know that he did not know. This is the particular quality of a memory removed by a thing that then ceases to exist. It cannot be noticed from the inside. The absence does not announce itself. The forgetting is seamless, and the seam only becomes visible from the outside when someone who remembers everything stands in front of someone who does not, and the gap between what is known and what is not known has the shape of a person. The mathematics of the incursion crisis had a specific quality that separated it from every previous existential threat the Illuminati had addressed. Previous threats, the Kree-Skrull War, the Infinity Gauntlet, the Secret Invasion, had been, at their root, manageable in the sense that they could be defeated. The enemy could be neutralized, the artifact could be disassembled, the infiltrators could be exposed. The incursion crisis did not have an enemy in that sense. The incursions were not attacks. They were structural failures, the universe's fabric tearing along seams that had been weakening for longer than any of the Council's instruments could accurately date. You cannot defeat a structural failure. You can only manage its consequences or address its cause or accept that the building is going to fall and position yourself accordingly. The Illuminati's approach, in the early incursion period, was to manage the consequences. This approach was taken not because they believed it was sufficient. Reed's calculations made clear it was not, but because addressing the cause required understanding it, and understanding it required time, and the incursions were not providing time. The brief membership of Steve Rogers in the reconstituted Illuminati deserves more than a footnote, because it represents the clearest possible demonstration of the Council's central failure mode. Rogers was brought in because he was Rogers, because his moral clarity and his operational experience and his specific relationship to the question of when extraordinary action was justified were things the Council needed at the moment it was beginning to build weapons capable of planetary destruction. He was brought in honestly. Tony told him what the incursion crisis was, showed him the data, explained what the Council was considering. Rogers looked at the weapon. He looked at the vote that was being asked of him. He looked at the faces of the men he'd fought alongside for decades, and he said no. He said no in the specific way that Rogers says no to things, not as a rhetorical performance, not as an opening position in a negotiation, but as a final answer arrived at by a conscience that had been developed across a lifetime of refusing to separate ends from means. The Council's response to Rogers's no was to remove the no surgically from his memory. This is the action that most clearly reveals what the Illuminati had become by the incursion period. A group that had decided, without ever stating it explicitly, that the consent of the governed was not a constraint on their operations but an obstacle to them. The machines were operational. The incursions continued. The vote that had failed the first time would be required again, soon, and the configuration of the Council and the configuration of the incursing Earth would determine whether it passed. The Illuminati sat in rooms without addresses and watched the countdown to the next approach, and waited for the question they had so far been spared from having to answer cleanly. The question was, when the Earth approaching theirs was inhabited, when it held people and cities and children and all the ordinary weight of a civilization that had not asked to be part of this, what would they do? Let your breath be slow. Let this chapter arrive without urgency. What happened in the incursion years deserves a particular quality of attention, not the bright alertness of something surprising, but the darker, steadier awareness of something you have been approaching for a long time and can now see clearly. This is the chapter where the Illuminati became something none of them intended. It is also the chapter where they chose to. The Great Society had a name that was chosen with the deliberate optimism of people who believed in what they were building. They were the defenders of an Earth in a parallel universe, an Earth that the Illuminati's calculations had identified as a future incursion point, with a margin of weeks before their respective Earths would reach collision distance. The Great Society had their own roster: the Sun God, who possessed power comparable to Superman; the Rider, who moved faster than any instrument could follow; the Norn, who commanded mystic energies on a scale that matched Stranger's capabilities in a different key; the Jovian, whose aquatic mastery gave him authority over 2/3 of his world's surface; the Boundless, who operated in dimensional spaces that the other members could not fully follow. They were not villains. They were not even, by any measure that the Illuminati ordinarily applied to such questions, bad people. They were heroes. They were the Illuminati's direct counterparts, built by a different history for the same purpose. The Illuminati found them before the incursion completed. They opened a communication channel, they explained the situation, the incursion, the mathematics, the window, the options. The Great Society listened. Their response was not what the Illuminati expected, and it was the response that, in the accounting each Illuminati member kept privately afterward, most clearly revealed what the Council had become by the time of this confrontation. The Great Society said that they would find another way, that they had faced impossible problems before and found solutions that did not require the destruction of anyone, that the Illuminati's framing of the choice as binary was itself the problem, and that a group of the world's greatest minds accepting that framing without exhausting every alternative was a failure of the imagination that the Great Society was not willing to replicate. The Illuminati's response was to point at the mathematics. Reed presented the analysis. Tony supplemented it with engineering constraints. The window was real. The timeline was accurate. Every alternative they had modelled, and they had modelled a significant number, produced outcomes worse than the one the Great Society was refusing to accept. The Great Society listened to the mathematics and said that the mathematics did not determine their choice, that there were things worth refusing even when the refusal produced worse outcomes by the available metrics, that some lines existed not because crossing them was always wrong, but because agreeing to cross them at all changed the kind of people you were in ways that changed every subsequent decision. The conversation ended without agreement. The incursion window was closing. The Illuminati had the weapon. The Great Society, this is the detail that sits most heavily in the accounts, the Great Society did not. They had never built a world-destroying weapon because they had never accepted the premise that one was necessary. The Sun God told the Illuminati, in the last communication before the weapon was deployed, that he was not angry. He said that he understood the logic that had produced this moment, and that he thought it was wrong, and that he was sorry for all of them. He said this with the particular steadiness of someone who is about to die, and has made his peace with it in terms the people killing him would not fully understand. Namor pressed the trigger. The accounts on this point are consistent and specific across every version of the events that the surviving members have discussed. It was Namor who held the weapon. It was Namor who activated it. The Sun God's Earth, the inhabited planet with its civilization and its heroes, and its Sun God watching from the sky, collapsed into the antimatter event that followed. The incursion ended. Both universes survived. The Great Society did not. The room was quiet afterward. This is another point of consistency across the accounts. No one spoke immediately. No one said that it was necessary, or that they had had no choice, or that the Great Society had been given the option and had declined it. The silence was the particular silence of people who understand that the thing they have done cannot be revised by discussing it, and who are therefore, for the moment, not discussing it. T'Challa left the council. He had joined, knowing the direction it was moving. He had hoped, it seems, or at least conducted himself as someone who hoped, that the direction might be diverted by the cumulative weight of the arguments against it. The Great Society's destruction removed any remaining ambiguity about where the direction was going. T'Challa told the remaining members that he had joined the council at a moment when the alternative to joining seemed worse than joining, and that the Great Society had demonstrated by their refusal and by the terms of their refusal that alternatives to the council's framing continued to exist and had not been seriously enough engaged. He left without drama. He did not take the weapon. He did not attempt to stop the council from continuing its work. He simply was no longer part of it, and the council continued. Reed Richards processed the event in the way Reed Richards processed events that exceeded the capacity of his ordinary emotional architecture. He worked. The work was not avoidance, or at least not primarily avoidance. It was the genuine production of a man who had concluded that the only thing more useful than feeling the full weight of what had happened was finding a way to make sure it never had to happen again. He modelled alternative incursion solutions with a focus that the other members recognised as something beyond his ordinary intensity. He found, as he had found before, that the mathematics did not offer alternatives. He worked through the mathematics again from different starting points. The mathematics did not change. Reed lived inside the gap between what the mathematics demanded and what he believed about the kind of person he should be, and he closed that gap in the only direction that the mathematics left open. Strange had made a bargain. The details of the bargain were not shared with the council, in keeping with Strange's general philosophy of managing mystic complications privately until they reached a scale that required broader disclosure. The entity he had bargained with, a being whose interests were difficult to align with the interests of anyone or anything you would want to align them with, had provided him with access to power of a scale that his post-sorcerer supreme capabilities could not reach on their own. The power was real. The cost was the kind of cost that mystic bargains always extracted. Not immediate, not obvious, and accumulating in a direction that the person making the bargain preferred not to examine too carefully. Strange was aware of this. He was not unaware of the irony that he had lectured other members of the council, over the years, on the specific danger of means-ends reasoning in the allocation of extraordinary power. Tony built. The incursion monitoring systems became more sophisticated. The weapon delivery mechanisms became more efficient. The infrastructure of a coordinated response to existential threats grew steadily more functional, and the growing functionality had the quality of growth that occurs when the people doing the building are very good at what they do and are doing it out of necessity, and have stopped, for the most part, pausing to ask whether the thing being built is itself a problem. Tony knew it was a problem. He had thought about it in the specific register of someone who has decided that the alternative problem is larger, and had made the engineering choice that that decision implied. The irony was not lost on any of them, though none of them articulated it in those terms. They had formed to prevent catastrophe. The catalogue of catastrophes they had contributed to by that point in their history was considerable. The Skrull infiltration and secret invasion, the exile of Bruce Banner and World War Hulk, the fracture of the heroic community during Civil War, the conditions that had allowed Norman Osborn's rise. And now, in the new chapter, they were contributing to a different kind of catalogue. The destruction of worlds they had voted to destroy, the construction of machines built for no other purpose, the removal of a man's memory when his conscience inconvenienced their operations. The quality that had made them exceptional was also what made them dangerous. It had always been both things. The difference was that in the early years they had been able to tell themselves otherwise. Somewhere in the accounting they were not running fully. There was a variable they had removed. His name was Steve Rogers. He was living with a particular absence, the seamless, unannounced absence of a memory that had been taken rather than lost. And he was conducting himself, in that absence, as a man who trusts that he is living in complete information. He was not. The removed memory would return. The mechanism of its return, when it came, would be violent and disorienting, as removed memories tend to be when the thing that removed them is gone, and the internal architecture of the mind begins, in its own quiet way, to notice the shape of what is missing. Steve Rogers would remember the council. He would remember the weapon. He would remember the vote. And he would bring that memory, fully restored, to the people who had taken it from him. The machines continued their work. The countdown to the next incursion ran on screens that no one else could see, in rooms that had no addresses, maintained by people who had convinced themselves, each in their own way, that what they were doing was the only rational response to an irrational universe. They were not wrong that the universe was irrational. They were not wrong that the incursions were real. The question, the one that T'Challa had raised by leaving, and that the Great Society had raised by refusing, was not whether the problem was real. The question was what kind of people you became in the process of solving it, and whether the becoming was worth it, and whether there was a way to know the answer to that question from inside the process of becoming. The Great Society's refusal to build a world-destroying weapon had been dismissed in the Council's internal framing as idealism, the kind of principled position that was sustainable in a universe that had not yet fully confronted the specific crisis the Illuminati was managing. This framing was not entirely wrong. The Great Society had not faced incursions at the frequency and scale that the Illuminati had. They had not run the calculations. They had not sat with the mathematics until the mathematics became something more than numbers, until they became the shape of a decision that no amount of additional deliberation was going to change. The Illuminati had run the calculations were right, and the Great Society, who had not run them, had nonetheless arrived at a position that, from outside the mathematical framework, was correct in a way the calculations could not capture. The tragedy was not that the calculations were wrong. The tragedy was that the calculations were right and insufficient simultaneously. that the mathematical certainty of the crisis was not actually a sufficient answer to the moral question of what you became in responding to it. Namor's inner life during the incursion period is documented primarily in fragments, in the accounts of people who worked alongside him, in the observations of council members who were paying attention, in the small markers of a man who was making decisions that cost him something he would not name. He had always understood, in the particular way of someone who had lived longer than most and had spent that long life in positions of genuine sovereign responsibility, that the cost of making decisions for others was borne not by the others but by the decider. He had made decisions that cost entire civilizations before, in the long history of Atlantis' conflicts. He had made them without paralysis because he believed in the necessity of the person capable of making them standing forward and making them. What was different about the incursion decisions, what produced the particular quality of silence that the other council members noticed but did not discuss, was that Namor had, for the first time in his experience of such decisions, no certainty that the necessity was real. He had the council's certainty, he had Reed's mathematics, he had the evidence of the incursions themselves, but he also had the memory of the sun god looking at him across the dimensional barrier with the specific expression of someone who had understood very clearly the choice being made and what it revealed. Time was running out, not metaphorically, literally in the specific sense that the incursion frequency was increasing, and the window between events was narrowing, and the mathematics that Reed had refused to stop revising were continuing to arrive at the same conclusion. The universe was collapsing. Every universe was collapsing. The walls between them were thinning at a rate that the Illuminati's intervention, however sustained and however costly, was not slowing. They had been managing the symptom, individual incursions, individual Earths, while the disease progressed, and somewhere in the accelerating decay of the multiverse's structure there was a cause. They did not yet know what it was. When they found out, the answer would be both older and stranger than anything the Council had prepared for, and the man who would eventually address it most directly would do so not through the genius, or the certainty, or the willingness to act that had defined the Illuminati's ethos from the beginning. He would do it through something else entirely. Let the breath arrive slowly. There is less urgency in the voice now, because this chapter moves more gently than the ones before it. Not because the events are gentler, but because we are near the end, and near the end the pace of things changes the way pace always changes, when you can see where you're going. Let yourself settle a little further. You are almost through. Steve Rogers remembered on a Tuesday. The specific day is not documented. It is an inference from the accounts of those who were with him at the approximate time, and the day of the week seems right for something like this. Not a significant day, not a day marked by any other event, just an ordinary day when the mind's own architecture, working in its quiet and persistent way, arrived at the gap that had been left by the removed memory and followed it to its edges. He was in a meeting, a different kind of meeting from the one whose memory had been taken. He was in the middle of a sentence, and then he stopped, and the people with him said that his expression changed in a way that was difficult to describe, and that he asked very quietly to be left alone for a few minutes. They left him alone. When they returned, he told them what he had remembered. T'Challa had left the council, but had not stopped watching it. He had maintained his own independent monitoring of the incursion situation. Wakanda's scientific infrastructure was sufficient, and T'Challa's personal commitment to understanding the thing he had walked away from was genuine. He had documentation. He had timelines. He had, in the careful manner of someone building a case that he hoped would never be needed, assembled a record of the Council's decisions and their consequences that was more complete than any single member of the Council could have produced from inside it. He gave this record to Rogers. He gave it without editorial. He let Rogers read it and draw his own conclusions, because he trusted Rogers' conclusions, and because he was not interested in shaping them. Rogers assembled a team. Not the Avengers in their standard configuration. That configuration was complicated by the ongoing incursion crisis. by the presence of people who had relationships with Illuminati members that would have made the operation difficult to focus. He assembled a specific group, people with the capability to locate and confront the Illuminati and the specific moral clarity to do so without losing sight of why they were doing it. The confrontation, when it came, was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was closer to a reckoning, an accounting conducted under conditions of obvious physical tension between people who had shared a world for decades and had arrived at a point where what they disagreed about was not tactical but fundamental. Sit with this for a moment. The tragedy in what followed is not that Rogers was wrong. It is not that the Illuminati was wrong. The tragedy is that both things were true simultaneously. The incursion crisis was real and existential, and the Illuminati's methods were a response to a genuine problem, and the Illuminati's methods were also genuinely wrong and had produced genuine harm and required genuine accountability. The universe was collapsing. The Council had destroyed worlds. Both of those sentences were true. The difficulty of holding both of them at the same time, without reducing either to context for the other, is a measure of how genuinely hard the situation was. Rogers was not fighting a villain. He was fighting friends who had done terrible things and been right about at least some of the reasons they had done them. The confrontation at the Illuminati's facility did not produce a clean resolution. Tony's systems slowed Rogers' team. Reed's preparations had accounted for most of the tactical variables. Strange's intervention at a specific moment redirected what would have been a definitive outcome into a situation that required continued engagement. The Illuminati escaped. Rogers' team was not defeated. It had accomplished the primary objective, which was not capture but documentation and public knowledge. The world now knew the Council had existed. The world now knew what it had built. The Council's operation in secret had depended on the secret, and the secret was no longer secret. Namor had not waited for the confrontation to make his own reckoning. He had been making it, in his private way, for some time. His conclusion was different from the one Rogers reached, and different from the one T'Challa reached, and it was characteristically Namor in its specific combination of ruthlessness and clarity. Namor concluded that the Council's approach to incursions, the deliberation, the votes, the moral weight, the reluctance to act until the window was nearly closed, was inefficient in a way that would eventually produce a failure catastrophic enough to destroy both universes rather than one. He formed the Cabal. The Cabal was a different kind of council, not brilliant heroes trying to prevent catastrophe while maintaining their identity as heroes, but people who had already resolved the identity question in favor of catastrophe prevention by any means necessary. Thane, Terax, Black Swan herself, Maximus of the Inhumans, the Maker, the Reed Richards of another Earth, whose scientific genius had not been accompanied by its counterpart's moral framework. They handled incursions. They handled them preemptively, without deliberation, without the votes that the Illuminati required, and that the Illuminati had found so difficult to reach. The Cabal destroyed worlds, not reluctantly, not with the quality of anguished necessity that the Illuminati had brought to the same action. They destroyed worlds with the efficiency of a process that had been stripped of everything except its operational requirements. They were effective. The incursion events they managed did not result in the loss of Earth 616. They resulted in the loss of other Earths in numbers that the Illuminati had not reached and would not reach at the pace of its deliberate process. The Illuminati looked at the Cabal's operational record and understood, in a way that required no explicit statement, what it meant for their own position. They had tried to prevent exactly this. They had been so convinced of the importance of maintaining some standard of behavior, some line between themselves and the kind of operation that operated without standard, that they had created the vacuum into which that operation had expanded. The Cabal was the Illuminati's shadow. It was what the Illuminati's work looked like when you removed the part that made it difficult. The last months before what became known as the final incursion had a quality that the accounts of the period described differently but consistently. The world was in motion. The conflict between Rogers' forces and the Illuminati, the Cabal's ongoing operations, the accelerating incursion frequency, the desperate science of a group of extraordinary people trying to find a solution that the mathematics had consistently refused to offer. But beneath the motion, there was something else, a quality of ending. Not the dramatic ending of things that resolve themselves clearly, with a final battle and a definitive outcome. The quieter ending of things that have been running for a long time and that are running out. Not of purpose, but of time. Tony and Reed spoke in one of the last documented one-on-one conversations between council members before the final events. The conversation was not recorded. Both men agreed, after the fact, that it was the kind of conversation that records itself in the people who had it, rather than in any external medium. Tony said, by Reed's account, that he had understood since the first incursion what the ultimate answer was going to require, that the mathematics had told him, early, and that he had continued to search for an alternative, not because he believed one existed, but because the searching was better than the alternative, which was to sit with the knowledge and do nothing while the time ran out. Reed said that he had arrived at the same place by a different route, and that the route had taken him to a conclusion that he had not yet shared with the full council, because the conclusion was personal in a way that council votes could not adequately address. The conclusion was this: the incursion crisis was not a mechanical failure. It was not a structural problem in the fabric of the multiverse that could be repaired by engineering or defended against by weapons or deterred by the accumulated power of the Illuminati or anyone else. It was the product of a specific action taken by a specific kind of being, beings who stood outside the ordinary structure of the multiverse and who had decided, for reasons that would require more time to fully understand than the remaining window provided, to end it. The Beyonders. The word was old in the cosmological literature, and the concept it described was older than the word, entities of such profound extra-dimensional capability that their relationship to the multiverse was not that of inhabitants or visitors, but of architects who had decided they were done with the building. Understanding who was responsible for the collapse of the multiverse was not the same as knowing what to do about it. The remaining members of the council understood both of those things. They worked within the limitation that understanding imposed, and they worked in the specific register of people who are doing work they do not expect to complete in time, but who do it anyway because the alternative is not to work, and not working is not something any of them knew how to do. The machines continued. The countdown continued. Rogers' forces closed in. The Cabal continued its efficiency in another direction. And somewhere at the edge of everything, in a laboratory built on the ruins of another Earth, a version of Reed Richards who had taken a different road was building something of his own. The Cabal's operational efficiency was, from the perspective of the incursion crisis's raw mathematics, genuinely impressive. Namor had assembled people who did not share the Illuminati's hesitation, who were not engaged in the ongoing negotiation between what the situation required and what they were willing to become in the process of meeting it. The Cabal treated incursions as a logistics problem. Identify the approaching Earth, calculate the window, destroy the Earth, close the incursion, move to the next one. The simplicity of this approach was its primary virtue and its primary horror. It worked, and it worked because it had stripped away everything that made working at this problem humanly tolerable. The Illuminati had built machines and then agonized over them. The Cabal built nothing. It used what was available, including means that the Illuminati had declined to consider, and it produced results that the Illuminati's deliberative process had not. The Illuminati looked at the Cabal's record and could not, in the terms they had established for themselves, condemn it. They had done the same thing. They had done it more slowly and with more apparent anguish, but the outcome was the same, and the anguish turned out not to have been a moral distinction. The final conversations between the original Illuminati members, in the last months before the final incursion, when the political situation had deteriorated to the point where the Council was actively evading Rogers' Avengers, while simultaneously trying to prevent the collapse of reality, had a quality that none of the participants have described in full, possibly because the description would require admitting that those conversations had a finality that none of them, in the moment, were fully prepared to acknowledge. Reed's account, the most detailed, says that the conversations were about mathematics. Tony's account says they were about engineering. Strange says very little, but all of them describe, in one form or another, a specific quality of presence in those conversations. A quality of people who have been in a room together for a very long time, and who know the room is ending, and who are not discussing the ending directly, because the ending is so large that discussing it directly would make it impossible to be in the room. They talked about the problem. They were always, in the end, people who talked about the problem. The problem was the most reliable thing they had ever shared. The reckoning came from within the community that the Illuminati had helped to build, and then had helped to fracture, and had spent decades navigating the consequences of both. The reckoning was not just about the incursions, it was about the accumulated weight of every decision the Council had made in secret, without oversight, on behalf of a world that had never asked them to. The question was not only what the Illuminati had done, it was what it had cost. Not in political terms, not in casualty figures, but in the specific cost that only becomes visible when you ask what the world looked like when the 5 most brilliant minds in it decided that their brilliance was authorization enough. The question had been asked. The answer was still being written. Let everything slow. The breath, the thoughts, the pace of the words. You're near the end of a very long story, and the end of long stories has its own quality, not the sharp resolution of something that finishes cleanly, but the gradual quieting of something that was always larger than any single conclusion could hold. Let the quieting happen. You do not need to hold on to the details. The shape of things is enough. The final incursion arrived when the calculations had always said it would, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of every projection that Reed had been refining for years. Earth 616 and Earth 1610, the primary Marvel universe and the Ultimate Universe, the 2 longest surviving distinct Earths in the multiverse's history, approached each other across a dimensional barrier that had thinned to the point of transparency. The heroes of both Earths were aware of what was happening. They had been aware for some time. The preparations that had been made, by the Illuminati, by the Cabal, by Rogers's forces, by the inhabitants of Earth 1610, who had their own extraordinary individuals and their own desperate science, had arrived at the same conclusion that all preparations arrive at when the thing they are preparing for is genuinely unavoidable. They were preparations, not solutions. Reed had built a life raft. It was not a life raft in the engineering sense. It did not float, and it did not operate on water. It was a structure designed to survive the collapse of the universes it was embedded in, built on principles that required the entire theoretical framework Reed had developed across his career as a scientist, and that required something more than the framework, a specific quality of mind that could hold the entire problem at once without being destroyed by it. Tony had built an ark. The 2 structures were different in their design philosophies, different in their intended occupants, and built in conditions that precluded any coordination between their builders. They were built in the specific isolation of people who have stopped believing that coordination is possible and have retreated to the only project they know how to complete alone. The Beyonders had designed the collapse of the multiverse as a test. This was not a metaphor or an approximation. The cosmological literature recovered after the events described them as literal architects of a literal experiment, beings who had created the multiverse as a controlled environment and had decided, for reasons that were either philosophical or indifferent or both, to conclude the experiment. The conclusion was total. Every universe, systematically, every Earth, in every configuration, every version of every person who had ever existed in any iteration of the multiverse. Total, because the Beyonders were thorough, and because nothing in the multiverse's structure had ever encountered a problem of sufficient scale to make thoroughness a relevant consideration. Nothing in the multiverse except one man. Victor Von Doom, Dr. Doom, in the configurations where that name applies, had been working on the Beyonder problem from a position that was, characteristically, both inside and outside every other frame of reference. Doom's relationship to power was not the Illuminati's relationship to power. The Illuminati had power in various forms and used it in service of a specific self-assigned mandate. Doom understood power as a property of the universe itself, as something that could be redistributed rather than merely wielded, and his understanding of the Beyonders was therefore not strategic but elemental. When the Beyonders' power became available, in the specific catastrophic moment of the multiverse's final collapse, Doom took it. He took all of it. He made himself the only thing left in the wreckage of everything that could be called a god. Battleworld was what Doom built with what remained. A patchwork existence assembled from the fragments of destroyed universes. A world that contained pieces of every Earth that had ever been, arranged in the specific configuration that Doom's will and the Beyonder power he now held could maintain. It was not a solution. It was a remainder. A man holding the entire weight of everything that had ever existed. Holding it in the shape of the world he had always believed should exist. A world in which he was in charge of everything and responsible for everything, and, therefore, unable to rest for a single moment from the weight of everything he was responsible for. Reed Richards arrived on Battleworld from the Life Raft. He arrived not as a general or a strategist or the leader of a council. He arrived as a man who had survived the end of everything and found himself in a place built by someone he had known for a very long time. The confrontation between Reed and Doom that followed was not primarily physical. It was the confrontation between two men who had spent their entire lives in a specific competition, who was the smartest, who was the most capable, who would be the one the universe ultimately confirmed was right, and who were meeting on the far side of the end of everything, in a place where that competition had been resolved by the fact of survival, and the resolution had not produced the feeling that either of them had imagined. The Molecule Man asked Reed Richards what he wanted. This question, asked by Owen Reese, the Molecule Man, who in one specific configuration of the multiverse's collapse had become the most important living being in existence, was the question the entire story had been building toward. Not what Reed could do, not what was necessary, what he wanted. The question that the Illuminati, in all its years of operation, had never asked itself directly. What do we actually want, separate from what we believe we are required to do? Reed answered. He said he wanted to fix everything. He said he wanted to give back what had been lost. He said this knowing that fixing everything required giving back his own certainty, giving back the Illuminati's architecture of control, the premise that brilliance was authorization, the comfortable clarity of decisions made in rooms without addresses. He said it anyway. The multiverse was rebuilt, not all at once, not in a single gesture of cosmic will, but gradually, the way things are rebuilt when the rebuilding is real. Piece by piece, with attention to each piece, with a care for what had been lost that was different from the care of someone managing a system, and more like the care of someone tending something that mattered to them. Reed Richards rebuilt the multiverse without an Illuminati, without a council, without a vote. He rebuilt it with something that the original council had never quite managed to fully embody, an acknowledgement that the limits of his own certainty were not a failure to be overcome but a feature of the situation, and that operating within those limits rather than around them was not weakness but accuracy. The Illuminati that assembled on Earth 838 in the film that introduced them to a much wider audience. Mordo, the Sorcerer, Maria Rambeau as Captain Marvel, Peggy Carter as Captain Britain, Black Bolt of the Inhumans, and Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four was a version of the concept built on a different foundation than the 616 original. It was a council that had learned, from the specific catastrophes of its own history, to operate with slightly more structural caution. It had learned this imperfectly, as all learning is imperfect. It had also learned it too late, as learning often is too late. and its encounter with the Scarlet Witch produced a demonstration of exactly the kind of failure that the original Illuminati might have predicted. A council that believes its own judgment is sufficient protection against threats it has not fully modelled. The MCU Illuminati did not survive its encounter with Wanda Maximoff. The 616 Illuminati had survived things comparably catastrophic over a longer span of time at a higher cost. The difference was not capability. The difference was time. The time to accumulate the specific kind of failure that only very capable people can accumulate across many years with the best of intentions. What the universe kept, after everything, was the question the Illuminati had been built to answer and had never fully resolved. The question was not whether secret councils of extraordinary individuals could prevent catastrophe. The record was clear that they could prevent some catastrophes and contribute to others, and that the accounting was not simple. The question was whether the premise underlying the councils, that some people are qualified, by virtue of their capabilities, to make decisions for everyone without everyone's knowledge or consent, was true. The record was equally clear on this, and the record was T'Challa's answer at the founding meeting. It was the Great Society's refusal. It was the Molecule Man's question and Reed Richards's answer. The premise was not true. The people who believed it most confidently were the most dangerous. The people who doubted it most clearly were the most trustworthy. And the people who could hold both of those things at once, who could act in the world with all the capability they had, and also remain genuinely uncertain whether they were the right people to be acting. Those people were very rare, and the Illuminati, for most of its history, had not been that. This is what the story has been building toward, and it is not a verdict. It is not a charge. The men who sat in rooms that had no addresses were not criminals, and they were not saints. They were people doing the thing that people with great capability and genuine conviction always do, acting on their best understanding of what was necessary, in conditions that did not offer clear answers, with tools that were imperfect and methods that were costly and outcomes that were never fully predictable. The tragedy of the Illuminati was not that they failed. It was that their failures were the direct product of their strengths, that the same qualities that made each of them extraordinary made each of them dangerous in ways that were difficult to see from inside the extraordinary. You cannot see the walls of the room you are in from inside the room. That is what walls are. There is something that settles in the accounting of all of this into a shape that is neither comfortable nor hopeless. The Illuminati built something. The building was flawed from its foundation, and the flaws produced consequences that were severe and real. And the universe, having processed those consequences, continued. Reed Richards rebuilt it without a council. Steve Rogers rebuilt a version of the heroic community on the premise that accountability was not the enemy of capability. T'Challa had been right at the first meeting, and his rightness was not a cause for celebration. Because being right about something like this is not satisfying in the way that victories are satisfying. It is just quietly, steadily true, the way certain things are quietly and steadily true, without requiring an audience. Let that settle. Let the story be done. 5 men sat in a room that did not exist, and they built something that changed the world they were trying to protect, and the world survived them. And the surviving was the point all along. Not their judgment, not their certainty. The world itself, which was larger than any council, more durable than any secret, and more patient than any brilliant mind that ever decided it needed managing. You can let the story go now. Let it move to wherever stories go when the listening is finished. Breathe. The air is quiet. The room you're in has walls that hold the sound of things settling. You're not in a hurry. Neither is this anymore. Battleworld had a sky that was wrong in a specific way that those who experienced it consistently described as almost right. The sun moved on the correct arc, and the stars, when visible, occupied positions that recalled familiar constellations without exactly matching them. The wrongness was not catastrophic. It was the wrongness of a copy made by someone who understood the original intellectually, but had not been formed by it. Doom had built the world from the fragments of every world that had existed, which meant that every person on Battleworld was living in a space constructed from the residue of their own destruction, and most of them did not know this, and the ones who did could not fully integrate what it meant because there was no reference point available for the integration. They were living in the aftermath of an ending, without the experience of having been there for the ending, in a world that felt like a world until you pressed it in the right place and found the seam. The legacy of the Illuminati in the rebuilt multiverse is not a monument. There is no inscription, no memorial, no institutional acknowledgement that the Council existed, or that its decisions shaped the world in the ways they did. The legacy exists instead in the ongoing conversation about what secret authority costs, in the specific wariness that the events of the incursion period left in the people who survived them, about the premise that any group of people, however capable, however well-intentioned, however genuinely expert in the management of extraordinary problems, can be trusted to manage those problems without accountability. That wariness is the Illuminati's actual contribution to the world they spent their existence protecting. Not the prevented invasions, not the managed incursions, not the distributed gems and the exiled banner and the warning to the Skrulls. The wariness, the specific, calibrated, costly knowledge of what happens when brilliance decides it is sufficient authorization. That knowledge exists now, in the Marvel universe, the way certain kinds of knowledge always exist after catastrophe. Not as information that people have, but as a posture that people carry, slightly differently than they carried themselves before. If you found this story worth sleeping to, let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I am always genuinely curious about that. And if you have a subject you would like this channel to explore, a figure, a council, a war, a history of something vast and slow and worth sleeping through, leave it in the comments below. The next story is already in the archive waiting for you. Sleep well. The room is quiet now. The story has moved through its full weight and arrived here, at the place where words become slower and the pace of the narration gives way to something that does not need to be spoken. The particular quality of a room in which something has been understood, or moved toward understanding, and the air carries the residue of that. 5 men, a table, a vote, the world, continuing. You have travelled a long way through that story, and the travelling was the point. Not the arriving at a conclusion, not the satisfaction of a verdict, but the long, patient attention of following something complex all the way to its end, without simplifying it, without needing it to be cleaner than it was. Let the breath arrive and leave without effort. You have done enough for now. The story has held its shape. You can set it down. The room is quiet. Somewhere outside, the world is continuing in the way the world continues, without councils managing it in secret, without votes taken in rooms that have no addresses, without any of the specific architecture that 5 brilliant men built and that cost the world specific things it is still, quietly, accounting for. The world continues. You are part of it. That is enough. You can rest.